Mr. Flores, there he is. How are you doing today, sir? You doing all right?
I'm good, and you?
I'm doing well, sir. I tell you, we convinced the children to actually eat dinner. That is an accomplishment in the world today. They're always able, the ego structure overcomes where they believe they can survive without food and that we're trying to kill them. And they're like, no, it's like, Haven, it's pizza. I know you can do pizza. Pizza is good. He's like, but it's like, you can do it. Meanwhile, you see, so we got three. We got a Haven, Grace, and Reed. Reed eats anything. Like he eats sushi. He's 2 years old and just stuffs sushi. And I was like, okay. Grace, eats a bite and is good to go, and she actually is, and then she's ready to water her zinnias. And Haven has a very long law of Manu on why he does not need to eat that evening that he goes down. So I'm like, it really is training me for law school, although it's too late. I don't get certification for this law school for some reason. I don't know, so we will see. But I'm well, Andrew. How are you doing today, sir? Is all well in Norfolk?
It's raining, surprisingly. Well, I shouldn't be surprised, like it'll be sunny for like 4 days, and then like the next day it'll just like rain like nonstop, and it's just like, okay, here we go.
Yeah, Virginia is famous for bipolar weather. We get four seasons by breakfast. And there was a massive storm on the mountain this evening that decided to pass us, but it may come back at 1 a.m. when it can wake me up. So we will see if it decides to do that. But well, Andrew, I just finished your lecture on ideology. I thought that was a tremendous to go through the series where you're talking with Marx. I think you put that very, very well, where when we get to Žižek, then ideology is like you're always already in ideology, as opposed to something external. I think in the versions where ideology has external sources, that's still kind of ascribing to, how do I put this? I call it the dream of the Enlightenment for autonomous rationality, which is the notion that rationality can overcome the symbolic, if you will. But you're always already in ideology. And also too, another thing that's interesting, as you know, in Lacan, you get the real, which is very different from the quote unquote ontic, which is kind of the scientific world. And Lacan's basically like, there is no ontic, if let's put it this way. Lacan is not saying that in a theoretical model, you couldn't, have an ontic, blah, blah, blah. The issue is that you're always already in a kind of milk and dye situation where the ontic has already been corrupted by the symbolic, and therefore you're dealing with the real. Well, up to Žižek, I think you're exactly right. There's still actually kind of lurking there the possibility of separating the symbolic, from the engagement with the world. So you have this dream of the ontic, which likewise then rationality, you can have the dream of the possibility of a rationality that achieves full correspondence with actuality, and you can get certainty, if you will. And Žižek's like, nah, sorry, man. Now it's important. Žižek is not saying that, quote unquote, it's impossible to know anything. It's just that you can't know anything in the sense of with certainty, or in terms of the ontic, you're always already in some sort of mediation. So I really appreciated how you went through the history of the concept of ideology. I thought that was really well done.
Yeah, I appreciate you watching that. Like that was probably like a work in progress, and then it was even like a project that Dave from Theory Pleeb tasked me with. He's like, you know what? He's like, I want you, and then Dangerous maybe Mikey, I want you both to elaborate on what the difference of ideology is. Like how does Marx have a theory of ideology, or if he does, and then how does it differ from Althusser and then Žižek, of course. And so like I was pretty much familiar with Žižek for like the past couple of years. He is actually my introduction into Lacan. And while I think Žižek is definitely a great reader of Lacan, I am more focused on like, what does Lacan himself have to say? And I think you summed it up greatly. Like, it's like the ontic is already corrupted, and especially using that's a Heideggerian term. Like it's funny because Žižek was, as he said, like a Heideggerian prior to engaging with Jacques-Alain Miller. So it's pretty funny that you brought that up. But yeah, like it was a fun little project to do. Definitely still part of, I guess, like my own philosophical project, understanding ideology, and it's just relation to the symbolic and the real. But my situation with Lacan and being situated by his theory is clinical, because I do hope to become an analyst one day, as I exit the Navy and enter back into the civilian world.
Well, good for you. Well, first off, thank you for serving in the Navy. That is an honorable undertaking. So thank you for doing that. And second, I think that's marvelous that you want to actually go into the field. You know, I think sometimes people forget, it's like, oh, wait, that is a field. I thought it was material for philosophy. Oh, wait, that's right. And I actually think it's quite important because, you know, to generalize, I am no expert in these fields. Anything I could say could be a horrible generality, and someone somewhere is vomiting every time I speak because of my generalities or different things. Like, you know, it's like, you know, every time a bell rings, an angel gets their ring. You know, every time somebody generalizes, someone comes over or something. I don't know. But you know, there's so much that if you're, you know, generally speaking, if I help you in a therapeutic sense, understand why, say, you're having a bad day, but I don't walk you through the mechanisms of self-deception that got you into the situation that caused you to have a bad day and simultaneously hid the source of your problem, then sure, maybe I'll help you have a nice week. But by next Monday, when you skip your cup of coffee, you know, your symptom may come back. I am always personally, I am fascinated by self-deception. One could say my entire ontological project, the work that Michelle, oh, by the way, my wife so much enjoys speaking with you. Thank you for the Instagram. Whenever I don't own a cell phone because when I touch one, my hands start bleeding. I take that as a sign. You know, I don't want to end up like the Nazis at the end of the first Indiana Jones movie. So, you know, I have a flip phone for the lake, but so thank you so much. So I am not nearly as entertaining on these forms of communication. But for
that
me,
is you on Twitter, though, right?
You know, because one has to bear one side of the cross. You know, if Michelle gets the right, if she gets the horizontal, I'll get the vertical. We'll see what happens. And I appreciate that. It's kind of fun that way. So it's like OG Opperman Garner. We do our work together, and it's fun to have it split like that. You know, people would not want to see my face, and Instagram is picture based, and so I figured if I hid behind words, I might have a better chance. But no, I think for me, I'm always, you know, a lot of what got me into my ontological project, Michelle, our work, is the question of irony. How is irony possible? Because irony is kind of strange, right? You know, because irony is not merely misfortune. You know, for example, there's it's that idea that, oh, that's ironic if something bad happens. Well, in order for it to be irony, technically following a literature, and the Russians are very good at this, like a Chekhov and a Godel and obviously Dostoevsky, is the notion that you want X and you do Y to get X, and Y is precisely why you don't get X. Like the very thing that you did to get the thing is why you don't get it. And had you not done it, you would have gotten it. That's more of what irony is. It's not merely say, you know, you forgot to put your coffee in the holder in the car and it spilled on you. That's not irony. That's just stupidity. Which I'll let you guess if that's based on a story from earlier. But irony would be where you particularly bought the car for the car holder, and every other car but that car has a car holder that would have held your coffee. That's irony, right? But you know, that's quite fascinating though, because how is it that the brain is, or the self, or whatever term, you know, operates in such a manner that it can generally end up in irony and really genuinely think it won't, because no one intentionally ends up in an ironic situation? Well, my gosh, the way that the brain structures reality told us must be very, very different. And I think the epistemology and ontology that one's developed, if you take irony quite seriously, one leads you to more something Hegelian, and that's another subject, but it also will get you into the psychoanalytical, because so much for me of the psychoanalytical is that kind of interesting of the mechanism of self-deception. How does that work? Because, you know, self-deception is what other people have. I'm really good at knowing myself, right? You know, in the same way that interpretation is what other people do. I just read books. Those idiots are the interpreters. You know, ideology is what other people are in. So, you know, but of course, that's the pride, that's the crown jewel of self-deception, to make self-deception what other people do and not you. And so what are the mechanisms by which we experience the world to make us genuinely believe we are not self-deceiving ourselves as we self-deceive ourselves? Oh, wait, by the way, if you're actually accurately understanding a situation, you're doing it through the same mental processes that arise to self-deception. Oh, crap. That's like a Schrodinger's cat thing in my brain. I don't, you know, having a cat in my brain is not so great. I like to keep them in the barns, you know, with the barn cat. So the topic to me of self-deception is fascinating. Just listening to what you were saying on ideology to move it to that realm. Because to me, when you locate ideology in the external, there's a chance of overcoming self-deception, because all you got to do is change your material condition. And then voila, you know, self-deception is a result of an external incubator, institutional soft power, you know, culture and so on and so forth. No. It's, you know, Žižek is like, hey, that's part of self-deception to believe
exactly.
that, you know, that's part of ideology.
Yeah, especially with the fantasy structure and the cynicism, the cynicism, which is like, you know, oh, I'm this like bystander that, you know, sees everything happening at a distance, but yet, you know, even though I'm in this situation, it somehow has no effect on me, you know, and that's what he would call like, you know, practical solipsism.
Absolutely.
And then like in the fact it's like, okay, now I am a part of this, but it's only because of X, Y, Z. And then that's like your fetishistic disavow of the thing. It's like money has no control of my life. Money is the root of all evil. But at the end of the day, oh shoot, milk went up by like $5. So, you know, I have to go buy more milk before the price is raised up because my children need this milk for their cereal, you know, that they won't even, you know, drink all of the milk for. They'll just like eat the cereal and waste the milk. But there's the fetishistic disavow of, you know, what he was saying. I think it's so fascinating because like, as I was saying in the video, that Marx was still under the Enlightenment kind of mindset where it's like ideas do have the precedence over us. So if we could just find the right ideas that align with the material structures, and that's the thing, it's like, in order to change the material structures, you kind of have to have the right ideas that correspond to that.
Yeah.
But yeah, and then like Žižek's thing is like the way he aligns like in the beginning of Sublime Object Ideology is that the structure and form of the commodity develops the way the interpretation of dreams has the form and content, or the form of the dream and the fantasy. And pretty much it's the fact that we think that there's this kernel behind it that gives it what it is, but rather that type of notion hides the fact that it's really the structural mechanisms that deceive you into believing otherwise.
Oh, absolutely. And first off, I'm wondering if you had a camera to watch my children at breakfast this morning with that story about the milk and the cereal, because that was very close to home. You know, second, and regarding milk going up, so I drive past the gas station this afternoon. And I go, you know, I should get that. I'll get it on the way back. And when I come back, it's up another 20%, just for fun. I just feel like at this point, they're like, just add another 40. I mean, it's, you know, it's bankrupting people. Why not bankrupt them twice? You know, a second bankruptcy on top of a bankruptcy, it's still a bankruptcy. So why not? So I think what you're getting out of the mechanisms, there is something, so a few things. One, there's a way to put it now to discuss Marx. You know, it's always when one discusses a thinker, you know, you've got 3 volumes of the Capital, you've got the German, you know, there's so much of Marx that one has to be, I'm not going to claim that I know exactly what the man thought. You know, he did actually quite a lot of books in history, you know, all this different work. But generally speaking, I think it would be fair to say that Marx is operating out of a place where the self is not really a subject, dare I say. You know, the ego component is not there. And to his defense, you know, it wasn't for anyone. So, you know, one has to be understanding. I think you know, it's so easy to look back on thinkers and old thinkers and be like, oh, come on, Marx, you don't have a robust theory of the psychoanalytical or human motivation or self-deception. It's like, yeah, no one did. And to dismiss Marx or to dismiss, I mean, Adam Smith, you can go through any of them. It's a terrible tendency. In the same way that we are always already in ideology, we are always already on the ideas that are given to us from the past that we stand upon that now seem obvious, right? You know, now it's obvious that there's this entire psychological component that needs to be included in Marx. Well, guess what? Had you been born 200 years ago, 100, you know, you would not have that. So, but generally speaking, what Marx may not have appreciated that contributed to him having a doctrine of determinism, that because he's very deterministic, he really did think that the global communist revolution would occur. The determinism is hard to hold on to when you take seriously the subject, because the subject brings in the Gödel kind of uncertainty principle. That's basically the source of it. And once you do that, you can talk about probability to the point where it's practically inevitable, but practically inevitable is not technically inevitable. Like, it's so likely that it's almost and probably will unfold in practice, but it's not exactly the same. And the thing that that you can see in Marx is this notion that people are going to necessarily be motivated by a certain, they're going to necessarily be motivated by a certain material condition that will compel them to necessarily turn against the owners of the means of production to come to own it, because there will be a certain alienation. Well, if the mechanism of self-deception, even if we take a Marxist conception of how people operate, if the mind can self-deceive itself into thinking that the alienation is somehow good, because say you're following, what God wants you to do, where you think, oh, it's good for my spirit because it humbles me, you can come up with a million possible interpretations for how alienation does not necessarily lead to reaction. Also, too, for example, if you bring in a doctrine of retirement, you say, okay, guys, I know for 60 years you're going to be alienated, but it's going to be worth it because then you're going to have retirement. That's kind of, you don't have Marx addressing why retirement won't work, right?
Yeah.
Retirement seems to work pretty well. Also, too, and it's a different conversation. Marx, I think there's a paper we did a long time ago called the Creative Concord, which is to say that you have the bourgeoisie who owns the means of production, you have the proletariat who create the means of production. I actually think there's a third class that I like to call the artifacts, or the people who create the means of production. In Marx, it would seem that the artifacts is the proletariat, but I don't actually think you should conflate those categories. And what capitalism can do is inspire people. What really creates wealth is invention. It's not money. It's like air conditioning. It's floors and different things. And you see what capitalism can do in the free market, not always. And this is an entirely different subject because you're now got to get into, well, is it really capitalism now? Because it's like a financialism. The derivative market is like bigger than 3 times the global economy, and we can on and on. So I'm not defending the status quo. I'm making a point. I'm making a point of the missing component, which is the creativity element and you see, the thing is, if people know that I could always theoretically start an entrepreneurship, even if they don't, maybe this is just part of ideology tricking you. I'm not saying that it's not, but when you have the ability of believing that it's possible for you to create something, to start a business, to create an invention, and that can help you at least rationalize your alienation. You see what I'm saying? And so that's a reason why the determination, there is not an appreciation, I think, in Marx. His material dialectic, which is this alienation structure, has a ventilation system called creativity. And in an ideological sense, creativity, obviously creativity is great if it invents air conditioning, but if we're talking in ideology, the possibility of creativity could actually function to keep you in imprisonment because you always imagine the day where you start your business and you never get to it. Now, on the flip side, I'm glad someone invented air conditioning. So I'm not saying creativity is bad, but it's interesting to think about the idea of creativity in functioning as an ideological ventilation system. And that is, I think, kind of works against the determinism in Marx, even if there's something valuable in the analysis of Marx. But you see, again, creativity is not even a doctrine that, for most of human history, creativity is something that God gives you and you just have it or you don't. So there was not an idea that you could say incorporated as a motivation for the average person. It was considered something that the muse visited or not. So I'm not, attacking Marx for that, but I think the creativity as ideology ventilation system is why it's not so deterministic, I think.
I think that's a great point that you made about the creativity. And this is something that Todd McGowan said in our discussion, that alienation can actually, at least in the Hegelian sense, propel you forward, in a sense, like we look at Sartre, there is a form of alienation in the subjectivity because it has to externalize itself because it's self-reflected negativity.
Yes.
And it has no point but to determine its own negation. And I would like to even rewind that to go back to, because we're talking about alienation and you kind of like mixed alienation with ideology.
Sure.
Alienation was more of something that he was using in his early economic manuscripts, which I like to follow the systematic reading of Marx through Louis Althusser, where he says you have the early, middle, and then the epistemological split, which leads to the middle, and then the mature works, which is Capitals, the Capitals volume. That alienation was his battle between the German idealism and then the humanist movement of Feuerbach. But you were mentioning that there is this creativity within the ideological structures that produce alienation, and it kind of propels forward. Because Marx did say that there is some kind of like inventive creativity or spark with capitalism that no other mode of production could do. But it's like, if we take what you were saying, like using both alienation and ideology in that sense, this is kind of like what Feuerbach was saying with the alienation of man in his essence with God. But there's this creativity in the way that we would kind of conflate God and externalize it to kind of propel us forward, because God essence is pretty much determined by the amount of alienation that we have. And you can see that in the same way now with capitalism, in which we enjoy a retirement because, you know, one day I will enjoy it. But maybe if I don't have that, it's because there is the big other that is allowed to enjoy. I know that there is an Elon Musk out there that is enjoying on a yacht. There are other celebrities or you know, the middle class, you know, the American dream. So feeling this objet petit a, you know, the object cause of desire, even if it slips out of my grasp and it continues to alienate me upon this, like, you know, hamster wheel, I know that somewhere out there, there is this enjoyment of the other being able to do that with the expense of my, you know, inability to enjoy because of my material conditions. That split is pretty much filled with creative fantasy.
Absolutely. That's marvelous. And first off, I have not had a chance to look at your conversation with Todd and all the young Žižekians. That was a great, I love that. It's a wonderful channel. I was so glad that I got with the Pleeb. That's a marvelous channel. I've got, you know, sometimes I look at my watch list and I'm like, man, 900, right? You know, I'm almost at 1,000, baby. But it just looks really, really good. I think what you get is very important. To me, what's quite interesting is how creativity comes to function within the ideology to come to make it okay that you're alienated. And so, you know, for me, what's interesting is with that creativity, because there's a difference between the idea of creativity and actually being creative. Yeah. And so, you know, actually being creative, a lot of our, you know, we just released a paper on what the dialectic between energy and creativity on Dietrich McCloskey and Volkov Smear. Basically wanted to argue there's a lot of talk about fundamental value, like is it gold, is it Bitcoin, is it the dollar, whatever, and so forth. But basically, if you do a thought experiment where you're wrecked on an island, gold's not going to do you much. Money's not going, Bitcoin's not going to do you much. What will do you a lot is food, an energy system, and the idea of how to escape the island. But you need energy to realize your idea, and you need the ideas to figure out how to get energy. So there's a dialectical relationship between those two. And the argument of the paper is that there's that fundamental value is actually a result of a dialectic between energy and ideas. And what actually is happening is people are conflating secure value with fundamental value. They'll say that Bitcoin is secure, therefore it's fundamental. Well, practically speaking, if you're always in a social order, yeah, practically it's like a fundamental value, but actually it's only when situated in the symbolic that it can practically function as a fundamental, but really it's just a secure source. And on a desert island, it's not going to create value because you can't eat your Bitcoin unless you know something I don't. And so there's a confusion of fundamental and secure. So certainly I don't want to say creativity in its actuality, in its actual being of creativity is not good. In fact, arguably all true wealth is a result of creation. Someone comes up with the idea for, say, the air conditioning, and no matter how much money Marcus Aurelius had, he couldn't get air conditioning, right? So air conditioning is something we can get even if we're not Marcus Aurelius. So that's real. So creativity is quite good. But what's interesting to me is how, I guess I've been thinking about for the last few days. So you've just gotten sucked into my thought process because I'm thinking about, okay, so the act of creativity is very, very important. And yet you look around and everyone's talking about the idea economy. Silicon Valley, starting these new businesses, the unicorns and different things like that. There's something about that doesn't seem as if it's actually creativity. Now, someone working over at Zoom, I'm so sorry, I'm not trying to attack your, who's ever out there on the Zoom call over listening us right now, you matter as a person. But it's a notion of how is it that the idea economy is actually functioning for the ideology of capitalism that is keeping people okay with their alienation, as opposed to actually generating inventions, say, some way we could do tidal energy or geothermal energy that didn't require so much concrete. That would be a big deal. Someone came up with that, arguably the world would be a better place. But someone creating another unicorn that makes them rationalize working 16 hours a day as their marriage falls apart, that doesn't seem to be the same as figuring out a new alternative energy. So to me, there seems to be this ideology of creativity, if you will, in capitalism, which I really like how you brought in Feuerbach, because there's a projection. There's definitely a projection sort of going on in the feed and so on and so forth. And I think that's a good connection. And then the actuality of creativity that generates technologies and different things. But of course, the horror is the self-deception. You say, oh, well, we call ourselves a creative economy. We call ourselves an idea economy. We must be creative. When you're not, that's actually functioning to your self-deception, where capitalism's not doing that. And in fact, I agree with like Tyler Cohn and Peter Thiel, and where they're saying it's been a good, there's stagnation. You've had the great stagnation for 20 years. That seems quite convincing. You have not had massive innovations in, public transportation for airplane speeds, cars. All the innovation has been very concentrated to the internet. And don't get me wrong, internet's great. I'm talking to you right now. It's great.
Yeah.
No one's saying the internet is bad. And arguably now, thanks to the internet, you can get an education the likes of which humanity has never seen before. There's no telling what will occur. But the innovation,
people are graduating right now.
Yeah, boom, right now. And so, but the innovation is still concentrated, is what Cohn, it's like in the computer. So you don't see widespread innovation, right? You're still using basically the same energy sources from a long time ago. Not that they're, that's a whole different conversation. So the point is, we're not actually creative, and yet there's a lot of talk of creativity. And I think it's funny because to me, it feeds to why does capitalism sustain itself against the Marxist critique? Because there seems to be a way that you can have the idea of creativity to have a new sort of projection. You've lost God, but you can still project horizontally into a new creative possibility of what you could do. And you go, oh, well, even if I'm, miserable, I'm helping support the next Elon Musk, and we'll get to Mars or something. So I really like how you put that.
Yeah. And I think the one thing is, because you're mentioning creativity, and then there's something that, because I really enjoyed the conversation that you had with Michelle on subjectivity, which was inspired by Trey. And it was just like this back and forth between the split, right? The split subject. But I think one thing that was missing, and I think this is the reason why, and it could be the motor force for the creativity, is that theory of desire.
Sure.
And that's pretty much the main thing. And not only am I like a proponent of this, but this is Žižek, this is Todd McGowan, and his Capitalism and Desire. Hell, this is even something that Deleuze and Guattari were talking about. Like, why is it that capitalism is able to overmind itself? It's like it takes its own kryptonite and uses it as a vaccine to make itself stronger, but then push that limit further and further. And so when it finally gets up to the limit, it's like, okay, how can I re-territorialize it and then make a market out of it? And one of the I think I said it on the talk with Trey about like how these micro movements, like the punk or the hip hop movement, were like these micro cultures to rebel against it. But then like the music industry became a thing, and that was the vaccine for the kryptonite, and it took a dose of it, and like boom, now you have a whole.
I really like that part.
Yeah, and it's like okay, these revolutionary movements, like in the form of music and rebellion, now became a market thing, and now you could get like a Bad Religion T-shirt anywhere, or a Wu-Tang T-shirt.
Absolutely. Oh, well, it's in the, there's always a kind of warning in the word revolution, because a revolution means full circle. There's a kind of warning where it could just end up where you go back to where you started. Is it, if you want it to be a negation sublimation where you return to what you start, but it's a new way, but it may not be. So you need to be paying attention. So if I were to give you the arc of our overall project, so the truism of the rational, you have 3 books. You have The Conflict of Mind, which is epistemology. You have Reconstructing ASA, which is ontology. The Map is Indestructible is part 2 of the epistemological concern, which is very concerned with the function of ideology, a lot of Kurt Gödel's, these, so on and so forth. Then you have part 2 of Reconstructing ASA. So when we were talking about the human, the subject, and the human subject, that's going to be that's part 4. That's the 4th entry in the first book of Reconstructing ASA. You do all of those, then you're going to have a sociology book called Belonging Again, which is done. I'm editing it and putting it out. Then you have another book called The Fate of Beauty, which is how I think aesthetic epistemology is quite important. And the last book is actually probably going to be called Intrinsic Motivation or something like that, because ultimately the only way you can, intrinsic motivation is where we're talking about desire. So, we're starting. So that talk is very focused on ontology, but you're exactly right to say that you ultimately have to get into a question of motivation and desire and different things. And what I was actually going to say before I forget, I'm glad you brought that up, is what's basically missing from Marx is a theory of human motivation and human desire.
All there is just need, but need is transcended by the productive forces.
Absolutely. And the thing is, so then here's the issue. You know, for Deleuze, there's this notion that one can escape capture and get their own line of flight if they do the schizoanalysis. And basically, it's kind of the notion that if you are uncalculatable, you will be able to escape capture because you cannot be calculated. So how can you avoid being calculated? Well, there's a risk here because if you're too uncalculatable, you may not be understandable and you might not be able to relate. And you might exist in a state where you yourself actually don't have relation or community and you go too far. But you see, here's the problem. If you don't go to that extreme, then you have some level of comprehensibility that the algorithms can get you and different things like that. So it's quite difficult. So instead, I think for me, instead of making your goal, how do I avoid being captured? Because you could go so far that you can't even comprehend your own self, ultimately. The question is, how do I find and cultivate intrinsic motivation, which is a theory of desire where I am my own first mover? Because capitalism operates on terms of extrinsic motivation by creating sources of motivation that are external to people that change what they want, and therefore they make themselves in the image and likeness of that external source. So the big $1 million question, it's a huge subject, is how do you teach intrinsic motivation? Can everyone be intrinsic motivation? What is intrinsic motivation? And the whole book starts with the question of how does anyone leave Plato's cave? Because, you know, a lot of people actually forget the prisoner who leaves Plato's cave does not leave on their own. They're dragged out.
Yeah.
They're dragged out. But we still have to ask the question, okay, well, someone had to at some point left on their own. Yeah. How did that happen? How is that possible? And to me, that's the question of intrinsic motivation, which gets into desire and all of those.
Not to mention the fact that his shackles were somehow released out of all the other prisoners.
You know, I tell you, if I can just randomly get a check in the mail that says you're independently rich, don't worry about it anymore. You know, I'll go, great. You know, I need my shackles to be released like that.
And I was going to say, like, with that point on Deleuze, I think that's like, and like, there's always this argument, like, you know, Deleuze by himself is always better than Deleuze with, you know, Guattari. But like looking at that, you see later on, like with his understanding of it on his essay, the postscripts on the control societies, in which, you know, kind of our freedom is maneuvered to where our control now operates from with home. Like now we take our work home, you know, it's no longer going to a disciplinary factory or, you know, institute, you know, everything is right here accessible on this laptop. You know, we are granted access by the passwords and the username or by the membership that we have. But also going back to the thing about desire, and then even when I was mentioning the transcendence of need, because Marx, you know, didn't have that motivation, or even, you know, theory of desire. I think this was something that even Deleuze was probably articulating in his essay. It was called On Instinct and Institution, and how most animals have, you know, obviously instinct. He compares the tick. He says the tick has like the 3 senses. It has the feeling because it's on the blade of grass. It has the smell because it smells the dog, and then the taste. So as soon as it is in that proximity near the dog, it'll fall and land on the dog and start to feed. But us, we make our instincts into institutions where they transcend our own instinctual nature to something that we have to instinctually expand or preserve the institution for the instinct.
Well, before I forget, I've never seen anyone do a video. I'm glad you brought up that essay. You should do, not to pressure you, I think you should definitely at some point do a video on that essay, because that's an example of a piece that gets forgotten. You know, where people talk about the societies of control and different things like that. No, I think that's beautiful. That's interesting. I always liked Guattari. I like his work on, like, Is Everyone a Fascist? Obviously, I find kind of interesting. I think he's an interesting, you know, 1,000 Plateaus. I suppose maybe, for some crazy reason, I sometimes enjoy Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake. So maybe that's part of my problem. And you know, when I get into anti-epidemics, I'm like, oh, I know this, you know, you know, these crazy literature books are different things. But no, I think nonsense, difference. It's interesting with Deleuze. It would be a different subject. Where Deleuze's ontology, I would even say, is quite beautiful when you talk about an essential difference of different things like that. It is curious, the disownment of the dialectic, you know, where he's really adamant against the dialectic that he has in Hegel. I find that very interesting. There are some arguments to be made that he ends up being dialectical, even though he claims that he's not. And it makes me think of how Harold Bloom argues that, you know, if you go through the history of artists, you know, there's the artists that people hate the most tend to be the ones they're most like and get ideas. It's the, and he talks about the anxiety of influence. And I do wonder sometimes, I'd have to write the paper, I'd have to go back on the difference in repetition, but I sometimes feel as if there's a, perhaps some anxiety of influence. Another example is actually Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard is very Hegelian, and sometimes Kierkegaard hates Hegel, but then for
schematism.
Yeah, and yet he proceeds to use like the infinite absolute negation as some of his strongest parts. He does a dissertation on irony that just screams the phenomenology of spirit.
Yeah,
and you know,
with the Antigone thing, right? Because isn't Antigone kind of like an irony in a sense? And absolutely. I was just about to mention Kierkegaard too with your thing about irony. Wasn't he like a proponent of irony?
Yes, I'm quite a fan of Kierkegaard, and you know, as I dove into irony and then found, wait, Kierkegaard did something on irony. It's like, maybe I'm not crazy. Maybe there's, you know, no, he was either or. As a philosophical thinker, I think was extremely valuable and extremely important. And actually, I have been told, I don't know if it's true. It's one of those things you read and you hear, you're not sure. But I was led to believe that Nietzsche, right before he lost his mind, was actually leaving to read Kierkegaard. And
so he was one of the ones he has not read because a friend was like, you know, you should read him, but he didn't know Danish at the time. But he had read Dostoevsky, and he was like, you know, the best psychologist, you know, in our time.
Oh, we love Dostoevsky, you know, and it would be very interesting how Nietzsche's thought about Christianity may have developed had he read Kierkegaard. Now, certainly the criticisms of a Platonic Christianity are extremely valid. Escapism are extremely valid. But every time Nietzsche encountered more existential Christianity, he was more taken by it. He was more interested by it. And that would be another subject on the difference between, you know, a incarnate Aristotelian, dare I say, existential Christianity of a Jacques Maritain or Gabriel Marcel. I could throw out names. But it's interesting. But Kierkegaard is also quite valuable in irony and delusion and different things. But I think all those subjects that you are describing, I salute you for taking them on. I did want to ask you, you know, what has made you, when one chooses, you know, who they're going to latch onto, and Lacan has been, you know, boom, you're latching, you really want to do a series on Lacan. So to interrogate you and put you under the light, I was going to shine a flashlight, but then I figured the camera of the Zoom was convicting enough.
I'm already on the gaze of the big other.
Yeah, you're already on. I don't need a flashlight. I'd like to say my intro. I'm like, wait, I should have asked that 40 minutes ago, but you're so much fun. So I asked you now. So go on now, my friend.
I would say that I got into like the French theory and even like modern critical theory and up to Lacan later in life. So I'm 25 right now. And then when I was about 16 is when I got into philosophy, but it was ancient Greek philosophy, a little bit of Eastern philosophy. So I read a little beginner's guide on Tibetan Buddhism. I read the Dhammapada. My favorite book was, or scripture from Eastern philosophy was the Upanishads. I still love it to this day. And then I started expanding on my Western philosophy, but it was always more along the lines of just like ontology or like, you know, traditional continental philosophy with metaphysics and epistemology. Never anything into critical theory. I did read the Communist Manifesto out of fun and just carried it around just to get my teachers upset. But I actually impressed my AP English teacher when I brought to school The City of God by St. Augustine.
Look at you.
After he was just like, we always had like great conversations. But it wasn't until COVID that I got into Žižek because, you know, obviously you have so much time on your hands, but, you know, it was already past 2019. The Žižek and Peterson debate had, you know, recently occurred in 2019, and, you know, 2020 was when COVID occurred. So I was like, who is this guy? Because I listened to Jordan Peterson because I was like, all right, you know, yeah, he's got all this stuff about like self-help, but I want to hear more stuff about Jung because I was really into Jung. I had a minute understanding of Freud, but I wanted to know more about Jung. And then he would talk about Nietzsche, and I was like, oh, I'm a big fan of Nietzsche. Nietzsche was probably like one of my favorite, you know, philosophers. I grappled with a little bit of Heidegger, but it was hard. But other than that, I would say Nietzsche, Plato, a little bit of Kant. But it wasn't until that debate had occurred, then I was like, I need to look at this guy. And then I stumbled upon other different content creators that led me into a spiral of reading French theory from Foucault, mainly because Jordan Peterson is like, Foucault is malicious, you know, malevolent. So I'm like, I'm going to read Foucault. I'm going to read Derrida. And I found out about Deleuze. So I read Anti-Oedipus, and that was probably like the ones that, like, I could say the few books that I actually finished from front to back and reread it. Still don't understand it. I could give a summary, but do I understand it to its totality? No, I still don't know what the difference between schizoanalysis and psychoanalysis is. But from that, I got into Lacan, and I just was like, what makes Lacan so great is probably the fact that there is more on the man's image than there is on his theory, at least from the outside perspective. And so when you actually read it, he doesn't allow you to be like, I understand now. It's like it's just a mission. And I think that's what I really like about him, and the fact that he brings something different to the table, because everybody, like if you bring up psychoanalysis in a random conversation, somebody might know Freud, or maybe they know Jung, and by the way, I actually go to Jungian analysis, so it's a little different, but I wish I could find a Lacanian or a Freudian, but like everybody knows either Freud or Jung, or maybe they are like Viktor Frankl, sure. or maybe you get some more nuanced people and they're like, oh yeah, Carl Rogers in person-centered, but never Lacan, really. You have to be really big in the academic community to really hear that name a lot. And I think that's another reason why I like him, but also the fact that his reading of Freud, in which he is like, we need to return to Freud. Like, there is something intrinsically valuable, and it's still valuable to this day when you read the essays from the Écrit, like The Function and Field of Speech and Language, his critique on psychic causality, and even like his, I guess you could say, his mentor, Henri, the French psychiatrist, pretty much trying to do a lot of things that you see today, where like things like schizophrenia, psychosis, other things in the DSM-5 are always reduced down to chemical imbalance. That's a little crude to say, but for the most part, they're always trying to find a epistemological basis of psychic causality, biophysiological causality, and necessary causation. And we could show that how that is due to more of like a epistemological error, or maybe some type of prejudice or bias, whatever you want. But it's the fact, it's like, well, you see the variables change. And then when you look at Lacan and his early writings, that because he came from a background of psychiatry, right, so he knows the game. And he saw that in psychotics or schizophrenics, that there was this discourse that if you actually listen to, there was a sense of meaning. And I think he gets this from being a Carl Jasperian psychiatrist, also existentialist. And he begins his introduction into psychoanalysis by the works of like Melanie Klein, and slowly going back to Freud. And also, at the time, he didn't really mess with the superego that much, but he knew that there was this strong sense of guilt and self-punishment, as he called it during the time, where like he said, for instance, like in the paper, there was this woman who stole something, but she felt so bad that she turned herself in. Right. So he's like, what's up with this self-punishment thing, this strong sense of shame and guilt? So that was like another motivating factor, why like, things like psychiatry can explain phenomenon like that. But mainly, like for me, I do find that his theories do make sense when you see the emphasis, and not only the emphasis, but even a theory and a structure using language on describing desire, its formation, and fantasy. That we're always caught in fantasy, where it's a daydream, a creative fantasy, but there's always some type of language structure that kind of situates it, and it is conditioning you. It's like, the ego is like, the guy from Clockwork Orange, eyes open, and then you just see the constant projector playing of your fantasies.
That's right.
Yeah, and I think that's the main thing that's important. But it was really Žižek that his understanding of it, and understanding fantasy and placing fantasy and cynicism as a forefront for ideology, that was like, wow, now I really got to read Lacan. So, I mean, ever since then, I read Seminar 11, didn't understand it, but I was still fascinated by it. I was captivated by it. I found Seminar 2 at a vintage bookstore in San Diego. Still have it. It's this one right here. And the only one where out of all the series, this one does not match with the rest of them. the Norton cover, like, it's just so weird. That's the only one that the design is just different. But that, and then I went on Amazon and I got, all the rest of them. I actually don't have like the Synthom one or I think the other side of psychoanalysis, and there's a couple other ones. But other than that, I am like, my project is to slowly study them, make content about them, but also grapple with the theory. And I do have a couple of commentary works on Lacan, but I mainly want to suffer and struggle trying to understand what this man is talking about in the actual seminars.
Well, I salute you for that. So first off, thank you for sharing with me the intellectual journey and the development that you've gone through. I find that magnificent. I did a lot of work, Hindu concentrate, so can tell you all about, I like the Hindu, you mentioned the Upanishads or Ramayana. I was actually revisiting, I was putting together a paper on the Mahabharata, which is an extraordinary text. But then I always feel like I need to read the whole thing, and I have not read the whole Mahabharata, only the abridged version, because the whole thing is longer than the Oxford English Dictionary ×9, which is extraordinary to me. I think it's the case that there's more writing in Sanskrit than any other language. I think that's the case.
Yes,
it's kind of incomprehensible, but it's.
I think the biggest text from the Mahabharata is probably the Bhagavad Gita.
Yeah, the Bhagavad Gita.
Yeah, that's one. That one's in there, right? If I'm not
Yes,
mistaken.
absolutely.
Okay.
Well, the things where you're going to have like Karna speaking, which is always fascinating. That's also another dialogue when Krishna talks with Karna, and Karna finds out that he's actually from a royal descent and didn't know because he thought he was raised by the boatsmen or different things. I mean, there are some extraordinary dialogues, but obviously the Bhagavad Gita is considered the most significant dialogue because that's where someone is caught between their karma and dharma. But right there is an
Arjuna,
example.
right?
Yeah, and that's an example too of one of the richness of these ancient texts that we've that is really philosophically rich and very important, are particularly these certain kind of paradoxes. Like, I would love it. I was speaking with my friend Dr. James Simpkins the other day, and he does work on military strategy in the NATO and in the EU and the movement of the Labour Party in the UK toward missile defense, ballistic defense missile systems. It's fascinating. We were just talking about how we need to replace the stupid trolley problem with the ballistic missile defense problem, and likewise with the Bhagavad Gita, the trolley problem is nonsense. But that's another subject. But the point I was going to say is, one, thank you for sharing all those things. There's a few things. I think there is certainly a bias in the favor of a chemical explanation for why things occur. And I think it's quite difficult for people to understand that even if you believe that the human is entirely a product of a material cause, it could be the case that those material causes have emergences that cannot be reduced to the material, even if the material is necessary. And that has been really, really hard for people to understand. Also, for example, as I am speaking to you, is it the case that there are biological chemicals that is making possible every word I am saying? Sure, probably, but it's irrelevant because we are speaking right now and we have to deal with the words that we are saying. Locating his analysis on language is the reason I think Lacan becomes particularly important, because words are particularly strange. And also words, even if words like we're speaking right now is a result of chemicals in the brain, which of course is a generality. My gosh, those chemicals are fast. My gosh, those chemicals are able to come up with these weird signified gaps. What is going on? This is weird. And if I were to locate the chemicals in my brain that is making possible, or the neurons or whatever, that is making possible this conversation right now, I doubt that those neurons will look anything like the words I'm speaking with you. And definitely so even if the ability of me to speak to you is only possible because of those material compounds, it cannot be reduced to the material compounds. And likewise, changing the material compound, let's say, okay, you can take this pill and it will transform the anxiety that you feel. I promise you there's no pill you can take to make you say exact words, only generalities within a mood, right? So even if pharmaceuticals, and I'm no way whatsoever am I saying these things are bad. The issue is they seem to be general. So for example, you have a mood disorder, you take a pill and now you have a better mood. Okay, but that's a generality. What about the particular words you say, like the specific sentences that you exchange? That is the realm of the subject. And even if the pharmaceutical is very valuable, say for helping people out of certain mental illnesses, you have not, in explaining and dealing with the pharmaceutical, if you will, the chemical, you have not addressed the subject and the exact speaking of words and what the speaking of words unveils. And to me, that's the distinction between what I like to say explanation and address. So for example, if I were to explain to you, why I'm drinking coffee at 8 at night, I would say it's because I put Maxwell in a filter and I hate myself. But that would not address why I feel like I need to drink coffee, because I have an addiction.
I got caffeine too.
Sure, we're brothers in arms. I appreciate it. A drain, in the philosophy of lack with Cadell and Ebert and Mr. Adler, then we talk about the difference between explain and address. And the issue is that what Lacan understands is that just because you explain why people do what they do, you have not addressed why people do what they do. And language is unique in its ability to address the human situation, the human condition, and so on and so forth. The religions understood this. You see quite an emphasis on speaking and words that are going on in religion. You know, we mentioned the Mahabharata. You know, there's that part where, if I recall, where Krishna is on the chariot with Arjuna, and Arjuna, it's always supposed to be that the charioteer gets off before the person who rides, and Krishna's like, no, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. And Arjuna's like begging and begging and begging and begging, and Krishna won't do it. And it's like humiliating for Arjuna to get off the chariot first, but he gets off first, and then Krishna does, and the chariot blows up. And Arjuna's like, what's going on? He's like, Krishna's like, well, the only reason the chariot wasn't blowing up is because I was on it, but I couldn't tell you that without violating your karma. So it had to be silent. So there's a particular order of speaking that had to be maintained, because if it wasn't, it actually would have other consequences that would cost Arjuna the war or something like that. And so you also in like the old, and look, you know, you'll have people talk about that, like mystical cantation, certain ways of speaking, words like om, you know, you can't say the name of God in Judaism. There's this sense that language is kind of, language is basically magical, which of course, if we don't follow it in this notion that it is magical, it is still special in the way that it traces out the functionality of the subject. And I think Lacan,
I was about to say, and that is what Freud even points out too, that there is this healing power of the speaking of the words, especially with Breuer and Anna O. But I really like how you said about what was it, explaining and addressing. So the way, and I think you said this too in that one video you did on the phenomenology of voice. It was that there's this I and you relationship, that it's not that speaking is trying to you know, relay like meaning. Well, yes, words have meaning, right? But the signified and the signified, there's an arbitrary relationship. And you can say that there's just like, even if we reduce language down to this chemical balance, there's an arbitrary relationship between the voice and the chemical.
Yes, exactly.
But the thing is that it's not even about relaying a message. It's an evocation. It's almost like a magical incantation, in which as I speak, I am evoking a listener that will hear.
That's right.
And I think that is the phenomenology aspect. That's what Lacan is kind of focused on, because language in its register is structuralist. He's worried about signifiers and its signification. But on the plane of the imaginary, in which I am in a dialogue with you, or the patient is in a dialogue with the analyst, there is the phenomenon of speech, its utterances, its, as you would say, rather than communication, it's communique, which is like a press release or like a radio broadcast in which I evoke a listening audience. There's a performative act and stunt which will eventually fail and humiliate itself. That's where we get at meaning, because we get into the full speech.
That's 100%. And for me, you know, there's a few things. I also wanted to mention one, the commitment to read a text that you don't understand and to keep reading it over and over again is, I think, a incredibly important undertaking that is not appreciated, because now people expect books to tell them what they mean, as opposed to books being like a wrestling match, like Jacob with God or something. You know, we don't expect that. And I think it was Mortimer Adler who said, he did the Great Book series, where he said, you know, the point of the great book is to be a kind of rock that you hit your head on, that you sharpen. I think R.R. Martin took that in the Game of Thrones, and he kind of stole it from him. Maybe he didn't, maybe, I'm not sure. But Mortimer Adler was basically like, you know, the great books are the ones that you know, it's like a sword, you sharpen the sword on, or different things. And he's like, he's basically in a conversation, and it may have been with Brian McGee. No, it wasn't with Brian McGee. I always imagine Art Adler and McGee talking, but that's not correct. I don't recall that occurring. But basically, Adler basically says that you don't think about something that you understand the first time you think about it. Like, thinking hasn't actually begun. Like, there's just, because you just grasp it. And often we confuse thinking with grasping, where we think if we understand it, that we thought about it. No, you just apprehended it. That's not bad. I like to understand that the ice cream is melting, so I eat it faster. No one is saying that grasping is bad, but the issue is that thought is not that. Thought is the having to revisit, having to redo, having to look at it from different angles. And I actually think it's how do I put this? Maybe it's one of the tricks of self-deception in the ego to believe that grasping is thinking, because of course you always grasp things naturally in tune with the way that sustains you in the symbolic order that you want. And if you actually believe that thinking was a revisiting and a chopping away at, then that would be a risk to tearing down your symbolic order and unveiling the mechanisms of your brain. So your brain, I always like to say the brain is a frenemy. It's your friend, but it's also your enemy. You need your brain to think, but it's also out to, you know, trick you. And so the brain seems to want to believe that thinking is grasping, because then it never thinks, and thinking is always dangerous. Like, what good is thinking if you think about it? You know, for the ego, right? All thinking can do is show that you're wrong. You already feel like you're right by definition, right? Otherwise you wouldn't do what you're doing. And if you think you're wrong, you think you're right about the way that you feel wrong. So you naturally apprehend everything as a grasping, as a coming to greater enlightenment. Man, if you started talking like thinking was thinking that you were wrong, oh, that sucks. No one wants that. Get that out of here. No one wants that stuff. So, but it's really important. In the act of the loss, I do think generally there was more of a culture, and maybe it's just because there wasn't a printing press, but you definitely see in the oral traditions, hey, revisiting, memorizing a text to the point where you've memorized it. Well, that's radical revisiting, right? And maybe to the point where it's dogmatic and it was bad, but there was still a culture of revisiting. Well, now there's a culture of move on to the next, which, don't get me wrong, I too can feel like there's a lot of amazing stuff on YouTube and 1,000 channels, and I have 900 videos in my watch list, and I'd like to get through them all. But that always has to be dialectically balanced with the realization, well, let's put it this way. One should never assume that a book is bad if you do not immediately grasp it. That's the dangerous assumption. Maybe it's just something you need to rise to the occasion to. That's also something that I think literature taught. You know, literature tended to do a better job of teaching that, but generally speaking, people don't read literature as much as they once did. You know, take that for whatever it is. And that can get you out of the habit of having to sit with a text. So I just wanted to commend you for doing that. The other thing I wanted to say on what we're talking about, it is very, you know, I'm mentioning this idea that you can say materialism is necessary, but you can't reduce to materialism. You know, vector theory is quite good with Alexander Bard and Alexander Lung, if you're interested. They talk about finding a materialistic doctrine that is irreducible, because you're always fighting reductionism. And, you know, Greg, you might also like, I love listening to Dr. Greg Henriquez. He talks also with John Vervaeke, who does work with the meaning crisis and so on and so forth. That is quite good. But I think when we're talking about language and the evoking and this bringing out of something, you know, and something, you know, when Lacan will say something where he's going to talk about, you know, we're basically linguistical. The construction of the subject is very linguistical, right? That sounds so crazy, like, oh, come on, man. But actually, if you pay attention to how much of your day there's a voice in your head talking, you start to go, oh, wait, yeah, I basically am a voice that's always talking. I'm just not always visible. Like, you know, people say, oh, I'm a visual thinker. Okay, I promise you, even if you're a visual thinker, that you don't just think in images. I promise you that you have a voice in your head. I've never met anyone that literally is purely silent. Like, they're not, I mean, I'm not, now, again, I've not occupied other consciousnesses. Maybe I'm just telling myself this to make my...
I've heard that, trust me. And then especially in the Navy, like, oh, I'm not good at test taking. I don't have a good memory. I'm a hands-on learner. I'm sure you have committed something to memory once. You're just not engaged with it. Like, most of the stuff we deal with is very dry. I don't want to read a tech manual on how to deal with an engine. It's very boring. I want to read Lacan.
And so, you know, there's notions of, you know, whether it's like the linguistic is so much part of you that you actually stop realizing that is linguistic. Because the other thing too, we forget it, but if you have if an image appears in your head of a duck, I promise you probably go, oh, a duck. Like, even if the image comes first, you probably still have a sentence follow that is linguistical. So once you start seeing that, you're like, oh my gosh, the voice is everywhere constantly. Language is everywhere constantly. And then once you get, oh crap, I'm always speaking in English. Oh man, well, that means I'm situated in a certain symbolic order. It's not necessarily good. It's not necessarily bad. Like, I did sign language for 2 years and literally started thinking in signs. And it was, I actually think it was wild for me. It was actually quite good. It had a big philosophical impact. I always wanted to do a paper. I haven't done it. On, you know, people will talk about learning Greek for, you know, you need to go to the classical languages for philosophy. I actually think sign language is remarkably philosophically rich because it is such a radically phenomenological language. You know, it really changes your thinking in profound ways. It had a big impact on my fiction, but that would be another subject.
And actually, I would like to ask, because when you said phenomenology, like, especially since you're moving your hands, would you say that's kind of like more along the lines of like, space and situation of like Merleau-Ponty and perception of the body?
Oh, absolutely. I love Merleau-Ponty. I think the Phenomenology of Perception is an underappreciated book. My wife has been reading, and we were going to do maybe an OG Rose on it. And, you know, I just did a paper on Benjamin Fontaine where there was a section where Benjamin Fontaine was talking, you know, where I was talking about Fontaine and Nicolas Bourdieu, but then a part on, you know, I always love when Ponier's talking about how you naturally, when you look at a painting, you move your body to situate it. You don't even think about it. It's just kind of automatic. And also, too, the part in the paper, it's called the best and most suboptimal, the most rational and suboptimal of all possible worlds to play on Leibniz. But the notion is that if you are far away from a lion, for example, and you didn't know it was a lion, you would be very rational to say it's small or that it's not dangerous. And so your phenomenal, like your literal location in space and time has an impact of what is rational to do relative to the lion. Right? Yeah. But then if it was really close, there would be a different rational action, right? And then what's funny enough is you would say, oh, the law of physics applied to a lion. Well, what if you got so close it was on the quantum level, right? Then there would be a new level. So your positioning in space and time impacts what the thing is and how you respond to it. So no, I think the Phenomenology of Perception is a really important book. And I mostly, when I use phenomenology, is talking more of Panier, as opposed to what I would associate. It would be another conversation, but I associate what Husserl, like Edmund Husserl was after, was something more like a, dare I say, a science of phenomenology. And I'm not sure about that. Not that I want to bash Husserl or anything like that. That would not be my intention. But like, for me, the phenomenology does get more tied into something quite Lacanian, you know, quite much into psychoanalytical, because it's like, what are you doing when you speak? What do you experience? It's like this kind of, you know, kind of examination. Like you say, there's a certain evoking that is occurring. And what Lacan understood is that evoking, one, is already situated in English, for example. And if it's situated in English and it has a certain structure that it has, and so the question then becomes the following: how can you trust that what you're evoking as pointing to something that is, dare I say, real? But then that's problematic, because what is the real, right? It's already, always already. But to what degree is the evoking, like, how can you trust what is evoked to not simply be positioning, situating itself in the symbolic order, right? Well, that's where Lacan's looking for the mistake, almost, if you will. And that's why I like irony. That's why I like the paradox, because it's these glimmers. We have a book called the Philosophy of Glimmers, these moments, these glimmers, these things that you see for a second that actually are that actually I think should be the focus of philosophy, where unfortunately philosophy has traditionally focused on the constant and the universal and the non-conditional and the straightforward. When really it would seem that because we are these self-deception machines, you have to base your philosophy more so on the momentary glimmer of something else.
And I like how we're like, I'm seeing the quilting and then the point, or like just kind of like going back into like you know, a knot of kind of regressing back to the earlier conversation, but where Deleuze would come in with these fields of intensities. And even in the logic of sense, he was dealing with paradoxes in the Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. You know, also getting away from, you know, universals and even the Platonism. He was dealing with the paradoxes of was it Zeno and the Stoics? Yeah. And definitely, like, I see him like dealing with more of like, you could say these, what would you call them, glimpses or glimmers?
Glimmers, I was using them.
Yeah, this is where in the field of intensity, moments of difference would come in. So
no, that's a brilliant association. I actually, if you were to put a gun to my head and say what part, I hope you don't put a gun to my head, but if you did, you know, I would say the book on where he talks about nonsense is some of his better work. That's some of his better work on his epistemology. But the issue with it is what I like to talk about. I appreciate very much on what he's doing, and he understands paradox and trying to avail. I believe that epistemology is in service mostly of trying to avoid the capture, mostly trying to avoid the conceptuality and different things like that. I like to go in the direction with an epistemology of, I want to call it conditionalism, which there are certain conditions that have to be met in order to have thinking. I really like, I was talking with Daniel Zaruba on this, In Praise of Shadows, which is a lovely book. And, you know, a shadow is such, an Eastern thought in general, I think, tends to be more conditionalistic. And what I mean by that is a shadow is very interesting because it's not totally dark. There has to be the right amount of light in the right position to make a shadow appear. Like when Tanasaki's talking about, you know, the bathroom with the gold, you know, the cups that have to be clean. There are, in order to maintain the certain aesthetic of the room, There are very specific conditions that have to be met to create a certain effect. The candles have to be lit over here. The objects have to be located here. People during the tea ceremony have to have a certain disposition. There's a kind of ritual that to be, and all of this combines together to create a certain atmosphere that is very real. It is not like relative. It is very real, but the conditions that make it possible are very fragile and they're very difficult to give rise to. And that conditionalism is what I am epistemologically very interested in. And I think it's a little different than an epistemology that focuses on paradox to the point where it's saying, yes, it's a kind of counter to, and it's better than the autonomous rationality through a dialectic of enlightenment that gives you totalitarianism. But I like conditional, I like talking about how art, you know, a painting, all the details have to be perfect. The lines, the colors, they have to be to create a certain effect. You know, if you have a movie, you know, if you've got Game of Thrones and suddenly aliens show up, you know, it may be better than the season finale, but it would not be what one would be expecting, you know, because it would not be fitting. So there's a certain logic to art, even though it's not an objective, you know, it's not like a hard grounded in absolute reality law, but art has laws in a sense, or principles that you have to follow certain conditions. What I find interesting is like thinking about the human in the epistemology of conditionalism and how they condition themselves. And there are certain conditions that unveil irony or the truth of how people operate that you have to catch and pay attention to. And so I like to think in terms of conditions. That was just to say that I appreciate what Deleuze is talking about. I end up focusing on these conditionalistic situations like shadows and veils are another example, which are always significant in religion. Veils are not walls, but they're also not totally open. These middle spaces, they block, but you also know there's something behind them, right? So these kind of conditionalisms and following an epistemology of that.
And so would you say like because it has an Eastern influence, that conditionalism is, well, to use the term conditionalism, would that be kind of like the same as contingency?
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah, because like if you look at like because that essay, right, on shadows, that's a Japanese essay, right?
Yes.
Then you have, like, for instance, in the Tibetan tradition, Nagarjuna with his middle path work, which is on emptiness, but it's like rather from inherent causation or like necessity or self-determination or anything like that, or independent causation. It's all conditional. There is no doer or the done. It's just the process of doing that's empty without a censor, pretty much. No fixed point.
Absolutely. And the reason, absolutely, you can link conditionalism with contingency. However, one of the reasons I like the word condition is because what do you do when you go to the gym? You condition yourself. There's a certain condition. There's the possibility of conditioning the subject to be able to apprehend new things, where contingency often has functioned as there's a certain unpredictability, a certain black swan, there's a certain contingency to history that is more external, where I want to bring a doctrine of contingency that also gives you a little bit, there is some element of control. You can, in fact, arrange your room in a manner to create a certain aesthetic effect with shadows in the East. You can condition yourself to understand William Faulkner better. You can train yourself to do certain things. And so you could say that it absolutely aligns with contingency, but with more of a notion of a feedback loop, where as I condition myself, I change the conditions of the world I am in, which makes me have different experiences that further condition me to condition different things, and so on and so forth, where you can have a kind of feedback loop. And this will also, the thing is with conditionalism, I think it more easily fits between, you know, the classic dichotomy that's always problematic, but it's everywhere, between objectivity and subjectivity, right? Where you say, oh, that's objectively true, or you say that's subjectively true, like that's your taste. Or you say, well, that's an objective non-contingent law. Well, conditions are, there are environments that exist if you meet the conditions that if you meet them are very objectively real, but they don't just come into existence magically, or they're just not always universally the case. So for me, conditionalism is a kind of middle ground that also actually will create a lot of primacy for aesthetic philosophy, things like that. And also contingency, you were mentioning the middle way and different, like emptiness. Very often emptiness, I think, you know, when we talk about lack, obviously that's Lacan. Lack is a kind of, I like a lot of lacks are not nothing is the name of a paper we did. A lack is, you know, even Aristotle and Thomas Joachim will talk about this, is a present absence. You know, nothing,
it's
you know,
less than nothing of Žižek.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And you know, when I don't want a cup of coffee and I don't have a cup of coffee, it's nothing to me. When I want a cup of coffee and I don't have a cup of coffee, it's a lack to me. It's a very present absence. And so the issue is in Western philosophy, because it's basically a break between being and nothing, there's no third category. Well, then all philosophy forms either on the side of being or on the side of nothing. And this is actually why, and this would be another conversation, although some of the say negative philosophy or negative theology can, like a Master Eckhart, can be good, it actually doesn't fall into this kind of middle, if you will, of lack, where you say, well, God isn't even God. Well, that's true. But the moment well, God isn't even that sentence. Like there would always be another layer of deconstruction to where you're not saying, like, if you have a purely negative theology, then it's not a, you know, it's not even that, right? And so ultimately, when you do a negative theology, you're actually participating in a kind of lack theology without realizing it, and then you just don't even do it well. And that's what can happen. Whereas in the East, there is more of an understanding. Like when they're talking about, like when, and you could say that Hegel with the A equals B, there's an Eastern kind of component there, and any contingency. The problem is a lot of times, like when people use words, and this is just language again, right? You know, when I say nothing, if I come from an Eastern tradition, I know that nothing is not literally nothing. Yeah. Like when I use nothing, I'm talking about a certain relation to the world. It's not like the world vanishes. It's still there, but it's a kind of no thingness, maybe because it's constant. It doesn't solidify as a thing. It's all just processes and becomings or energies or flows or whatever you do what you want. You know, you call it nothing, but really what you're doing is destabilizing the thingness to open yourself up to a new way of being. Well, if you're a Westerner and you hear the word nothing, that just means the opposite of being, therefore it's stupid. And so you don't think about it. And so that, I think that's certainly happened in Western philosophy, where when I look at someone like Lacan, there is certainly actually Eastern logics that are operating there.
And then that's another reason why I kind of find it interesting, especially the destabling of the ego, which he also gives credit to Freud, but the misunderstanding throughout ego psychology, you know, seeing that there's the ego that we have to exercise and rehabilitate and make it, like, you know, productive and healthy for the social order. And yeah, like what you were saying is if we hear nothing in the Western tradition, it's like, it's just like, you know, I have no use for nothing, or worse, in epistemology or in ontology, it's nihilism.
Yes, that's exactly right.
It's just two extremes.
Oh, no, that's exactly right. Because if you don't have lack, it's either being or nothing. And, you know, and then the problem is if it's being, then it's pure being, and that can go into the stable, the total self, totalization, autonomous rationality, so on and so forth. But then if you have nothing, well, you know, that's not too good. So you end up, it's a problem. Well, no, with Freud, that's exactly right. Because Freud, I would never, ever, ever equate the ego with the Schopenhauer will, but there is an influence of Schopenhauer, and Schopenhauer loved the Upanishads. You know,
I love Schopenhauer.
And so those kind of flow together. And then there are some correctives, obviously, with Nietzsche and so on. You know, but then this is the part where one has to sit and do an entire analysis of the will and representation and how that's different from Freud. And I will, as much fun as that would be, one would have to say from that. But no, for me, a logic of conditionalism is also good, because the thing is, if there's a feedback loop and you're always thinking in terms of how do I condition myself, but I'm always being conditioned back. So you're always aware. So you're like, and I'm always already in the symbolic. I'm always already using language. So I'm always already being conditioned. Oh crap, I better start fighting. You know, I better get my game on. It's already on, right? I'm always already in the kind of fight against myself, per se. That's a more violent language, but it really is a kind of battle. I mean, your brain is in the business of sleeping. It wants to be lazy. Your brain does not want to know truth. It wants to feel right. Those are very different things. Your brain wants to feel like it knows the truth, because there's no other way to feel like you're right. So it has to relate to the truth in such a manner that it's just enough to feel like you got it, so you can feel right without actually going so much into it that it unveils you have no idea what you're talking about. So it wants to feel right. Well, you're always already then being conditioned by your language, by your symbolic order, or whatever, so forth, to feel like you're right. And if you don't actively fight that, you're going to fall into it. And then you could say, well, that's not so bad, because what you guys are talking about sounds really great. But the problem is, this is politically significant, but because then This is how you get a society that falls into what Hannah Arendt called the banality of evil, which is basically thoughtlessness. You know, the banality of evil is not where evil is boring, it's thoughtless. And thoughtless does not mean stupid. It means a state where you operate according to principles you do not question. You just thoughtless. It's just assumed. And, you know, the banality of evil formulates, and your brain is in the business of getting you to a state of being thoughtless. But then at the same time, if you're just a pure deconstructionist that tears everything down, you get existentially overwhelmed and you turn to totalitarianism that way. So you have to find a middle way, dare I say.
Yeah. And that could also be because I really like how you brought up the banality of evil, and Hannah Arendt is somebody who I really have to really get into, especially since as Heidegger's lover.
Oh yeah, dude.
And I'm really into Heidegger. I wouldn't say that I'm that, you know, knowledgeable of Heidegger, but Dave's assistance has been helping me understand Heidegger more. Absolutely. But like bringing up the Hegel situation is that, and this goes back to like not even just like what Deleuze, Foucault, Derrida believed, but also like somebody like Adorno believed that, Hegel was the reason for you know, totalitarianism with this totalization. But that's if you take Hegel as a totalized thinker of synthesis. Right. And this is something that Todd McGowan brings up. But there's a book or an essay that was brought up by a certain author in the discussion that we had with Todd about the problem of Hegel and synthesis and totality, which leads to you know, the recognition that you know, language does have some construction on the political discourse, but because we're dealing in synthesis, it's like at least the identity politics of like everybody will have their own discourse. We could agree to disagree, but we're going to somehow merge like oil and water. But we can't engage too much because then it's disruptive to my own identity as being an oppressed, you know, African American person or a oppressed queer person, you know, or like just the list goes on with the different amount of politics. But Hegel as a thinker of negativity and contradiction, in even capturing those differences, is something that can help us not capture, but I guess transcend or sublate and bring forward that contradiction through the split.
Absolutely. You know, a few things. So first off, before I forget, one of the things I wanted to say is what I think Deleuze did understand about when he's trying to destabilize logic is that there's a natural tendency to think only in terms of, and this will also tie on what we were saying about the emergent and Lacan and different things. I like to say that there are two kinds of causality, and it's always dangerous to say there's two of anything, but I'm going to do it because I'm feeling really gutsy tonight, is that there's a low order causality and a high order causality. What I mean by that is low order causality is where I take a billiard ball, roll across the table, hits another billiard ball, and it goes from there. High order causality is I take a billiard ball, roll across the table, hit another billiard ball. And I remember that time where I played billiard with my sisters when I was 5 years old, and I need to call her. The second is indeed a cause and effect. There was indeed a very real cause and effect, but it's not observable. Only I can know it because only I have the relationship with my sister, but it's very real. We only ever observe low order causality. And it's very natural, and it's very natural for us to start to believe that's the only real causality, is the low order causality, and to completely discard high order causality. But here's of course the problem with that. Most people's traumas and you know their psychological states are a result of high order causality. And
I was just about to say that too.
That's exactly right. And if you simply reduce it to low order causality, then you're going to have a problem. You end up with reductionism, and you also can't understand what Lacan is doing. Also, what Deleuze understood is that low order causality tends to lead you to totalitarianism because it's just straightforward. If we create the right environment, if we do X, Y, and Z, it will cause the perfect state. It will cause the fixed subject. It will cause us to overcome our symptom or whatever. Well, no, that's not how it works. So what he did is he went about destabilizing logic and showing how even if he proceeds to show that if you follow low order causality to its logical end, you end up in no logic. So low order causality ultimately will unveil, and low order logic. Here's the thing: when I say that we in the map is indestructible, we'll talk about low order causality, low order creativity, low order about everything, honestly. And so, like, if you think, which is just linear, very causal, it's high order is dynamic, emergent, things that cannot be reduced to simple metrics, and so on and so forth. When you only have low order thinking, you tend to end up in totalitarianism, and people tend to be reduced, and you tend to get the othering, you know, we're the good, they're the bad, you fall into the banality of evil. So low order causality is in service of all that. And Deleuze proceeds to attack it for those reasons, and as does Derrida for very good reason. And Adorno also, that's where he's saying, look, the Enlightenment gives you, and also I would say David Hume, but that's a different subject, led to the Scottish Enlightenment. Also Vico understood that very well as well. Vico is actually, one could probably make a career on comparing the new science with Lacan. That is a bold statement I just made, but I cannot defend it, but I think it could be done. I think Vico and Lacan actually have a lot of overlap. 300 to 400 years ago, I think Vico 1670, so a little early, but he was really smart. So low order causality can lead you to a lot of problems, because mostly the human is the subject. Like, we operate mostly in higher order. We do not tend to plan our day according to cause and effect. You know, basic low order. We will be walking to the living room to get our cup of coffee, and remember that we haven't paid our bill, frantically go back to the kitchen, spill the coffee on the way, then we're cleaning, and as we clean, we go, oh crap, I haven't cleaned my car. There's this mixture of cause and effect, responding to high order, responding to low order, forming and going from that. All of that you lose if you just think of humans in terms of low order. And language tends to be the prime vehicle of high order causality, because the sentence enters your mind, I need to call my sister. That's my sister. And so language and high order, because the other thing too, right now, you have no idea of what I'm about to say to you, right? There's nothing in this room that will hint at the next word that's about to come out of my mouth. It's completely, in a sense, unknown. And then when it occurs, it's going to be like it could have been no other way. You know, words always feel like determinism. So I'm about to say a word. Squash. Was there anything in the room that calls me to say squash? Was there anything in the environment? Did you know I was going to say squash? There's a reason I said squash, is because I forgot to water the squash this evening and I'm feeling convicted. That's why I said squash. So there's a logic to it. But I could have easily remembered the tomato plant. I didn't water either and said tomato, right? So you cannot understand this in terms of low order. You have to pay attention. The only glimpse that you're going to get of the logic that the subject is following is language, and the fact that they say X instead of Y, because it tends to be a very free act, right? It tends to be a very free associating. It's a free associating. But the thing that's also fascinating about language is it's this radically free thing, but the moment that it's said, it's like deterministic. And what I mean by this is the following. Once I say squash, you have no choice but to exist in a world where you hear me say squash. And if I say to you something mean, this is trauma, right? Like if I say to you, you suck, you are now forced to live in a world where somebody said to you, you suck. So out of freedom comes this determinism that you're now imprisoned in, and like freedom, imprisonment. And so much of trauma is this kind of, it was out of the blue. It was like ex nihilo. There's, you know, and then it obviously wasn't, because if you look at the situation, there may have been evidence it was going to happen, so on and so on. But anyway, the phenomenology of language itself entails this fascinating interplay between freedom and determinism that the subject has to live with and come to terms with, and is very, very traumatic. Speaking is always risky. Speaking is always weird. Speaking is always difficult. And so if you really want to understand how the subject, you know, gets by and survives, following language tends to be a very good map. Precisely because of the gymnastics you have to play with determinism and freedom, and with high order causality that's all operating on those different terms. Deleuze, I think, understood this, and he wanted to get us to look at it. But you see, the problem is because he disowned psychoanalysis, you know, he disowned Freud. He wanted nothing to do with Hegel. He was on to something that, to really complete what he wanted to say, he had to go back and befriend people that he had disowned. And it's kind of a tragic thing in some respects that he planted his flag like he did, because of Deleuze that would have really taken a Hegel and really taken a Freud would have been quite fascinating. And actually, I think you can do that work despite Deleuze, because actually Žižek in Body Without Organs, or Organs Without Bodies.
Organs Without Bodies.
Yeah, he proceeds to do that. And I think he's right, actually. The other thing I was going to say, because I'm not going to let you go, is that I hope you have nowhere to be. You're oh, great, boom, you're stuck now. You shouldn't have told me that. But Hegel, when you talk about the totalizing of Hegel, I was recently, because I guess this is what crazy people do, reviewing The Elements of the Philosophy of Right, which is arguably the book that creates the impression so strong of totalitarianism, and trying to go back in the state and trying to go back and be like, all right, Hegel, the frick are you doing? Because, you gave us the phenomenology of spirit, which I think Dr. McGowan is completely correct, really is Freud before Freud. There's an emphasis on contradiction as becoming. There's a destabilizing of ontology. And then you get the element of the philosophy of the right. You're like, really? Oh,
and don't mention the science of logic, where it's like, pure being, is reduced to nothingness, or nothing.
Well, the thing that's so difficult with Hegel is, I think sometimes with the Hegelians that emphasize the emphasis, the early Hegel, the phenomenology of spirit, will kind of sometimes pretend like the later Hegel doesn't exist, because it's so difficult to figure out how to square them. Now, I think Todd McGowan, I guess, what is it, chapter 5, where he talks about the infamous, the rational is the actual and the actual is irrational, where he talks about that and he explains what he means. And I think Dr. McGowan is right. Even the freaking Cambridge translation of The Elements of the Philosophy of the Right, we're like, it's not what you think, guys. It's not what you think. And then even later on, Hegel in later lectures repeats that aphorism, and he adds becoming, where he says, the rational is the becoming of the actual, and the actual is becoming rational. So he adds language, and he feels guilt. He's like, no, I didn't mean that. But even if you follow that, there is no doubt that there's this language of the state that seems to suggest this ever-growing totalization that is occurring. And so how does one square that? Well, I ended up with a 60-page paper, because I don't know why, going through that. And I think there's a few things. One, I think we have to associate the state in Hegel, not just with the governmental state, but the state of nature. I think he is very concerned about people thinking philosophy is elitist and it's just a waste of time. And he wants to say, no, philosophy arose at a certain point of the state because it is now necessary for the state to not fall into effacement, to actually continue. There is a notion of also philosophy being necessary to examine the very situation that one is in, so that they can. So this is the kind of funny move. Philosophy needs to get a total grasp on the situation so that it can then let that go, and let go of it well.
And that's funny that you say that too, especially in examining Hegel in a new light, because if you read the reproduction of capitalism and ideological state apparatuses by Louis Althusser, in the beginning, when he says, like, what is philosophy in the introduction, he says the same exact thing, but it's ironic because he's anti-Hegelian.
Well, that's always kind of the funny thing, is a lot of, like, Benjamin Fontaine is a good example. I tried to, who I discovered recently with John, and Benjamin Fontaine is an example of a thinker that you're like, oh, I didn't know about this guy. Crap, who else do I not know about? So you're like, oh no, I need to read everything, and there's something called bills. Crap. But Benjamin Fontaine basically hates Hegel, and I want to argue he ends up like being Hegel. It's great. A lot of them do that. But anyway, what I think you see in Hegel, I think Hegel's prefaces are always kind of a wink wink. And in the preference of The Elements of the Philosophy of the Right, he really goes on and on, talking about how people today, philosophy is something that people don't think you need to do. Philosophy is something that people always think that they can do without ever reading Aristotle. It's just this, he's like, no one thinks they can do science who's never been in a laboratory. But lots of people think they can give you the position on the moral absolute good of the universe who've never thought about it, right? And Hegel's playing on that, and he's like, this is a problem. And what he seems to really want to do is that he wants to say that philosophy has that the movement and development of the state of the human race, not just the governmental state. Now, there's a later stage where it moves from morality into ethics, where that's going to lead you to government. But government is a manifestation of the state of humanity, but it's not equal to the state of humanity. You can't say that the state in Hegel is the government. It's more like the state of nature. almost. But the funny thing is, whereas in Rousseau and Hobbes, the state of nature is a hypothetical thought experiment that Hegel wants to make his state of nature the movement through history. So it is very concrete. It is not a hypothetical situation. It is the state of nature is history. Yes. So he also wants to show that the development of the state of nature, there is good reason to think. Now, this is the key. There's good reason to think that the development of the state of nature is better with time. Not certainty, and not in a way where you can necessarily say in what ways it's better, but generally speaking, there is reason to assume that the world today is, because it's still around, is at a higher level of development than the ages past. That doesn't mean it's better. That doesn't mean we're superior human beings, but that the way that the state of nature has developed, there is reason to assume that we should go with it. And this is actually it's actually a really important move, because why not assume that prehistoric man had it better off? Why not assume that it would be better to have lived in the 1820s as opposed to now? And here's the thing, this is what Hegel, I think, realized. If you cannot assume that the present moment is worth thinking according to, then you cannot stop epistemic nihilism. Because you could always deconstruct yourself. You can always say, well, how do we know that the world now is the world we should think about? How should we not try to change it? Hegel's also really trying to balance his love of the French Revolution with his criticism of the French Revolution. This is very interesting. So Hegel plants that tree, everyone knows the story, and then he proceeds to be critical of the revolution. This is very strange. Where there seems to be in Hegel a desire that revolution has a necessary reformative function to the state, but it also can go too far. And so he wants to have revolution that doesn't totally undermine. Well, how does revolution not become a total undermining if it's not allowed, if it cannot assume that the now is worth preserving, right? Yeah. You see what I'm saying? So Hegel is all about reformation. But the only way for revolution to be reformation is if it believes there's some sort of nugget in the now that's worth preserving. Yeah. Otherwise, every revolution must be total. And if it's total, what is it? It's a return to nothing. Yeah. And so he's trying to give, so there's a move of giving you reason to assume that we should think the now, as opposed to try to escape the now, and to assume that philosophy has manifest at this now for a good reason, and thus he's justifying philosophy. So there's two moves that's going on. Yeah. He's saying we are justified to assume the now, and we are justified to do philosophy, which, you know, if you already philosophize, you accept both of those premises, but the majority of people don't. And so he's doing, for me, the elements of the philosophy of right end up being it's Hegel justifying Hegel. He's basically a way to look at the philosophy of the right is he's saying, hey, you see that phenomenology of spirit book I did? That's legit. You know, that's justified. I've shown to you that philosophy is justified. I have shown you that you're justified to think the now. Now go do that, phenomenological journey, as Cadell Last talks about. It's not a waste of time. So the name of the paper, I end up calling it Hegel's Justification of Hegel. And if you think of it that way, then the Hegel of totalization, and I'm starting to, for some reason, the last 2 weeks I have struggled with my voice and I've been losing it. I'm really having a wonderful time because I'm losing my voice, and I'll have to, I'm so sorry. I'll have to draw this to a close in a few minutes. I will have to do this again. This has been magnificent. I really appreciate your time. But the point is, what is viewed as a totalization project of Hegel, in my opinion, is actually a justification project of Hegel. That ultimately is a justification of the philosophical journey that makes you realize absolute knowing, which is ultimately an integration with lack and limit. Yeah. So that's how I try to put them together. Yeah.
So my only question is that when you say that for Hegel, that there must be something worth preserving in the now, this is something that's like radically different from like the radical denial and escapism with revolutionary movements of his time, especially with the French Revolution. And then on the one hand, with German, let's say, nationalism, or like with this tradition of conserving the past, a past that never was, right? Would that be correct in interpreting it that way?
to be saying that Hegel is concerned about those kind of revolutions that completely undermine it, but he would also be critiquing this nostalgic. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That is, I think, actually the balance he's trying to strike. He is not, you know, I always find it very interesting. I'm so sorry. This is terrible. You know, this is what happens when you have kids, I guess, because you're telling them not to, you know, not to run outside naked all day. But it's always fascinating that you have leftist Hegelians and right Hegelians, right?
Yes.
So what it means is that there have always been people who have able to find a more progressive view of Hegel and a conservative view of Hegel. And that's because he's actually, I think, critiquing both. The problem is, I do think Žižek is correct in that Hegel does write the philosophy of history and the philosophy of right in a manner that seems to be patting the German, you know, the government on the back, the university on the back. I think that's true. I think he is intentionally using language that can go either way. I think there's an ambiguity. I think the critical component to understanding the philosophy of right is the abstract right at the beginning and what he means by that. And actually there's a very rich psychoanalytical interpretation of the abstract right. Once he moves into the sections on morality and ethics, I think it's, if you don't capture what he does in the section on abstract right, it's very easy to read ethics and morality in service of a nationalistic project. Now, I may fail at making that argument. I'll release the paper, we'll find out. But that is the effort of the paper. Andrew, I have loved this. We will do this again. I've recorded this. I'll send you the recording. Thank you so much for your time. I've really enjoyed this. This has been a thrill.
Thank you. It was a great conversation, Daniel.
Absolutely. We will do it.
I think it was such a great conversation that my kitten is even.
You have a kitten? Oh my goodness. I have just loved it. I don't know how it's about. Well, you're in the same time zone, so about 9:40. So I've enjoyed. We will do this again. Andrew, thank you so much for your time, sir. Best to you. I'll get you the recording here to use. I've really enjoyed this. Thank you so much, sir. Appreciate it.
You have a good night.
You too, Andrew. Thank you, sir. All the best to you.